Today on Think Like a Leader, I want to address a controversial phrase, and maybe we could call it a controversial doctrine. It's unfortunate that it's controversial because it is a phrase lifted straight from the words of Paul in Romans 10. I considered putting a trigger warning on the title of this message because some people, when they hear this phrase, the word of faith, part of the people will go into this weird, self-absorbed, self-centered, materialistic doctrine of prosperity that has been a pollutant all over the world. The extreme prosperity teaching that is somehow rooted not in this biblical phrase that Paul uses, but in sort of a distorted idea of the word of faith. On the other hand, others are triggered by this phrase because they're influenced by doctrine watchers, sort of the self-proclaimed guardians of some type of doctrine, and they have become anti-word of faith. And so I'm not anti, I'm not pro, I'm biblical. And I think if we want to think like a leader, we need to push aside the extreme views that are somehow rooted in misunderstanding of this, but we also need to push aside all of the critical and labeling people that even say this phrase as some type of being doctrinally off. So if we can go straight to Scripture and see what Paul actually said and then apply it to our lives, I think that we'll find out what the word of faith really is. So let's talk about the word of faith. Let's look at Romans chapter 10, beginning in verse 8. But what does it say? We'll get back in a moment to it. What is it? What does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. This is what Paul wrote about the word of faith. He says this idea of the word of faith, and then he ties it to the confession of our mouth and belief in our heart. And he uses an illustration of salvation, how we get saved. He's saying you confess with your mouth, you believe in your heart, and we're saved. It's not some magical formula we say, but there's this belief that is confessed. And we see that principle all through Scripture. What it is not, it's like one of my roommates in college, a guy named Greg. A bunch of us were going to lunch together, and he called from the top of the stairs and he said, "Hey, I'm not going with you because I'm sick. I have the flu." Then he says, "But I'm not confessing it." See, that's the distortion of what this is. It's not that, he was convinced he was sick. He believed in his heart he was sick, but he had this weird thing of he couldn't admit it. No, faith is what Abraham did. He acknowledged the weakness of his flesh, and yet without his faith shrinking, he still believed the promise of God, even though his body was as good as dead. So there is this faith of the heart, believing the promise of God, not believing something we just made up, not believing something that we are lusting after, not believing something that's rooted in our own greed and our own striving for comfort and anything, and pushing away from anything that's uncomfortable or causes us to sacrifice or suffer. That's not what it is. It's attached to the promise of God. So this scripture, when Paul lays out this idea of the word of faith, to understand it, we have to back up a few verses and get the context. And what we find is he's really talking about righteousness. So in verse 8, when he says, "But what does it say?" And then he says, what it says is, the word is near you, in your heart and in your mouth. That is the word of faith we proclaim. He's saying it. What does it say? What is the it? It's talking about righteousness. And there are two types of righteousness we see in the foundation of this word of faith text.